Why would this government not take an opportunity? The 15 classes of offenses that you removed in C5 are very significant violent offenses, including every single drug offense under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Why wouldn't this government take an opportunity to strengthen our criminal laws as opposed to weaken it?
Oh, yeah.
6-minute round with Mr. Brock.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your attendance, as well as your officials from the department. Minister, after a decade of catch and release Liberal bail, repealing mandatory minimum penalties, and other hug-a-thug laws, Canadians are understandably scared. Since 2015, human trafficking has increased by 84%, sex assaults are up almost 76%, violent crime up almost 55%. C16 egregiously continues the Liberal soft on crime agenda by empowering judges now to ignore literally every mandatory prison sentence in the criminal code other than murder and treason. Liberals are now trying to allow judges to ignore them for aggravated assault with a gun, human trafficking, and multiple firearm offenses, including extortion with a firearm, weapons trafficking, drive-by shootings with a restricted or prohibited firearm, and more. Parliament Minister sets mandatory minimums for these heinous crimes for a reason. But if your government allows judges to ignore them, there will be nothing mandatory about it, period, full stop. The passage of this provision would be a total abrogation of our duty as elected representatives to keep our communities safe. Conservatives will never vote for lighter sentences for serious offenders. Will your government immediately split off this poison pill so we can all get back to work making this bill better and keeping Canadians safe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have respectfully a different point of view from my honourable colleague in terms of the value that this bill is going to offer more broadly. I take the closing comment in his question as a endorsement, at least, of some measures within the bill, if not the provisions that apply to mandatory minimum penalties. On the issue of mandatory minimum penalties, though, there's a particular piece of context that we need to understand. Because I know the member asking the question believes that the government should adopt laws to protect against the harms he's enumerated. I share that desire, sincerely. We all want strong penalties for serious crimes. But we have to ask ourselves, what value is a mandatory minimum that exists on paper that is not recognized by law after decisions by the court striking down those mandatory minimums? If our laws written into the code are not enjoyed in our communities, then those laws are not with the paper, are not worth the paper on which they are written. Today, the mandatory minimums that include those that were subject to the Senville decision offer no force of protection for Canadian victims. We might feel good about what the code says, but if the court is going to strike down those provisions and not incorporate them into the sentencing regime, we can't say that there is a functioning mandatory minimum regime today. We made a decision to restore those mandatory minimums, taking the constitutional guidance from the court, so they will actually be put in place and will demand reasons from the court in circumstances where they deviate from the mandatory minimum. Keep in mind, we're not dealing with some widespread discretion. We're dealing with circumstances that are so excessive as to outrage standards of decency, in the court's words, or that would be intolerable to society. And we think we found the right approach.
Thank you, Minister. A glaring omission in Bill C-16 is the lack of reintroduction of the 15 offenses that your government, that you voted for, Minister, in the passage of C5 in the 44th Parliament. Will your government reintroduce all those mandatory minimum penalties for those offenses that were removed?
Mr. Chair, one just sort of historical development piece of this bill that's important to understand is the Senville decision arrived as we were preparing the contents of this bill. We made the decision to respond, and we thought it best to address the issue of mandatory minimums that existed today, that were baked into the code previously, including those that remain in the code and those that were struck down. We didn't do a full-blown...
Just a reminder, gang, smash the like, hit subscribe. We work really hard at this stuff. Let's get back to the video.
consultation about either provisions that had been removed by Parliament or those which could potentially be added or removed from a mandatory minimum regime. If that's an issue that this committee would like to study to provide guidance, I would welcome that guidance, but it would be important to actually conduct that consultation.
Only reason I raise this is your predecessor, David Lametti, was very proud of the fact that mandatory minimum penalties do not work. In fact, he's quoted numerous times, and the quotes have not aged well over time, given the rising crime levels in this country. But I put to him the very possibility that the Supreme Court of Canada could be upholding mandatory minimum penalties that C5 removed. I raised that as an issue, and sure enough, after royal assent of C5, the Supreme Court of Canada in the Hill and Hillback joint decision upheld the mandatory minimum penalty that was removed by C5. So given the Supreme Court of Canada has upheld a number of mandatory minimum penalties that have been in the existence of the criminal code since the late 1800s, why would this government not take an opportunity? The 15 classes of offenses that you removed in C5 are very significant violent offenses, including every single drug offense under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Why wouldn't this government take an opportunity to strengthen our criminal laws as opposed to weaken it?
So I don't view Bill C-16 to weaken Canada's criminal law for the reasons that I've articulated in the opening set of remarks. It strengthens them in a number of particular ways. Back to the question that you've asked, when we were moving forward with the decision to address the consequences of the Senville decision, we were dealing with the umbrella analysis around the protection of mandatory minimum penalties as across offenses. We did not do
Yourself, Minister?
All right, Mr. Brock, you're actually out of time. I was just allowing me an opportunity to answer your question. So.
Thank you.
Happy to address further in response to
if you want to finish your answer.
Look, only that if you're going to add or subtract particular offenses from a regime that purports to impose mandatory minimum penalties, you should appropriately engage with stakeholders, with experts, with law enforcement to understand which provisions are going to have the most meaningful impact. That would be an excellent task for this committee to take on should you wish Mr. Brock to make further recommendations. Having not done that policy work, given that it was outside of the scope of the initial intended range of measures included in the bill, I don't think it would be appropriate to start adding new offences to that regime without that policy work being done in advance.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Mr. Brock.